Getting into comic books can feel a bit like traveling to a new country. You're not sure of the rules or what everything means, and the details you learn from movies and television turn out to not be very accurate, leaving you constantly having to research what the heck is going on. Welcome to Top 10 Nerd. I'm Andrew Boyd, and today we will be taking a look at the top 10 most convoluted comic book stories. We're going to be approaching this from the perspective of someone who is familiar with the basics of the characters involved and is trying to get into comics. So like, you've seen all the Batman movies and then tried to read Batman Year One and you're fine, but if you tried to read Batman Incorporated you'd be a bit confused. Let's dive in. Number 10. No Man's Land. Speaking of Batman, in 1999 we were given the infamous No Man's Land arc. In this story, Gotham is struck by a massive earthquake and is cut off from the rest of the country. The government writes the city off as a lost cause, and the various villains form gangs and begin taking over areas of the city and claiming it as their territory. Batman has to work to bring order back to the city by working with his fellow local heroes as well as the GCPD. The concept seems simple enough, but what can make the story kind of convoluted is its sheer scale. No Man's Land was the most ambitious crossover in DC history, requiring the writers to develop maps and charts to keep track of where everyone was at any given time. The story was told across all of the Batman and Bat Family titles, such as Batman, Detective Comics, Shadow of the Bat, Legends of the Dark Knight, Robin, Catwoman, and Nightwing. The story spans over 100 issues of comics, making keeping up with the story when it came out an expensive and difficult to keep track of endeavor. Number 9. Crisis on Infinite Earths. By today's standards, Crisis on Infinite Earths isn't too convoluted. I mean, we're used to getting a crisis event every few years from DC, but the original is worth talking about. By 1986, the DC multiverse had gotten so convoluted that editorial decided that they needed a way to streamline continuity. The story is almost a last hurrah for the convoluted original continuity, with multiple versions of characters coming together to save the universe. As a result, there is a lot of people and storylines to keep track of before the multiverse is eventually destroyed, leaving only one Earth with all of the histories either being erased or combined. It's convoluted, but with the goal of becoming less convoluted by its end, which is a noble enough goal. Number 8. Green Lantern is difficult to start reading. I'm gonna be brief with this one, and it's more of a personal one. I really like the concept of the Green Lanterns, but every time I try and read any of their stories, I get confused. There are way too many members of the team who you are expected to follow, and then when you finally figure that out, you learn about the yellow, red, blue, and orange lanterns, each with a different emotional spectrum. Add to that the Guardians of the Universe and the central power battery containing a demon named Parallax who makes them unable to affect the color yellow, and there's just a lot to keep track of. I hear that a lot of their stories are really good, but their history is so convoluted and there is so much homework involved in understanding the lore that it makes Green Lantern a really intimidating title to pick up. Number 7. Superman's continuity. For decades, Superman operated in the New Earth continuity. This is the Superman who showed up in 1986, had the Death and Return arc, married Lois Lane, and had all those classic adventures. In 2011, DC rebooted into the New 52, featuring a different Superman who hadn't had those adventures and was dating Wonder Woman and all that stuff. It was different, but easy enough to follow because it was a different continuity. Then, one day, things got weird, and the New Earth Superman showed up right as the New 52 Superman was dying, revealing that he had been transported to this universe with his Lois years prior along with their son John, and had been hiding out the whole time. So, he became the new old Superman. So we had New 52 heroes, except Superman, who was the New Earth version. Eventually, to try and retcon this a bit, it was revealed that the two different Supermen were actually two halves of the real Superman. They merged into one person, thus combining their continuities. This was Rebirth era, where everyone was getting their continuities mixed a bit, but just when this was getting figured out, we got Infinite Frontier, where everything is canon if you want it to be. Now, this might be the most controversial thing I've ever said on this channel, but this stuff with Superman is a prime example of why canon is extremely overrated. Number 6. The X-Men, Marvel's most notoriously convoluted series. Despite their reputation, you can pick up an X-Men comic and start reading and not be too lost. But there is a lot going on that makes the story of the team difficult to keep a handle on. Besides the massive cast of characters who each have ridiculously intricate family trees, there are cosmic forces like the Phoenix Force to keep track of. Characters like Cable, who are coming in from alternate timelines. And just when you figure all that out, everyone moves to a living island that the bad mutants are put into a weird mental prison in. Individual arcs are okay to get into, but if you look at the story of the X-Men as a whole, it is hard to deny that they have a pretty convoluted history. Speaking of the X-Men, number 5. Wolverine Origins. Wolverine has been alive for a very, very long time, and as a result, he has been through a lot, giving him a very complicated family history. For a long time, his history was a mystery, but over time, it got over-explained. In 2006, Marvel created a series called Wolverine Origins, which was about Wolverine discovering elements from his past, including how linked he is to other characters. This isn't a bad thing, but it doesn't really add to the character's mythos in any meaningful way. For example, he discovers that James Hudson of Alpha Flight, who was one of the first people to help Logan after his Weapon X experiment, was actually one of his cousins. Not only that, but Hudson's half-brother was actually Professor Thornton, the man who captured Wolverine and experimented on him to give him his metal claws. What an interesting revelation. One of his best friend's brothers is one of his worst enemies. Does it ever come up or have any impact on the plot? No, but it sure made his family tree more complicated. The story is filled with these kinds of revelations, which don't really impact the character and have the same energy as Dark Helmet telling Lone Star that he is his father's brother's nephew's cousin's former roommate. It just means absolutely nothing. Number 4, One More Day. Despite the fact that the Spider-Man movies basically just keep telling the same stories over and over again, with a very standard status quo, Spider-Man has grown a lot as a character since he was first introduced. He graduated high school pretty early in his history, and married Mary Jane Watson eventually. They were expecting a child, but MJ had a miscarriage. Peter was a teacher for a while, and during the events of Civil War, he actually revealed his secret identity to the world. Marvel editorial looked at all of this character growth and went, "Blah! Ugh! How do we get back to the status quo people expect?" Their solution was One More Day. In this reviled story, Aunt May is dying, and Peter wants to do anything to save her. The demon Mephisto shows up and offers to save May's life in exchange for Peter and MJ's marriage never having happened. He also makes it so no one remembers that Peter is Spider-Man. The couple accepts the deal and wake up with no memories of their marriage. Now, this has caused a lot of confusion over the years regarding the canon. Basically, stuff like the marriage and miscarriage never happened because Mephisto altered time, but all of the adventures that Spider-Man had were still canon, but were affected by a memory wipe. So stuff like the Clone Saga, that relies on the couple's marriage being a major plot point, happened, but slightly differently, I guess? Oh, and Civil War happened. Everyone just forgot that Spider-Man revealed his identity. The actual story is easy enough to follow, but the long-term effects it has on the character's history are really difficult to nail down, and not really worth it, as its only purpose was to get Spidey back to his roots as a lonely single guy, rather than exploring the character and allowing him to grow. Thanks, I hate it. Number 3, the death and return of Superman. When someone decides to start reading Superman comics, one of the first comics they are probably looking forward to reading is The Death and Return of Superman. Now, even if you are totally caught up with all of the Superman continuity, at that point, there is a lot going on in this story to try and keep track of. There's all the various replacement Supermen to keep track of, like the new Superboy, who is a clone of the original and Lex Luthor, the cyborg Superman, who's really an astronaut who Superman slighted at some point, the Eradicator, who turns out to be a Kryptonian robot designed to protect Superman, and Steel, who is honestly the easiest new character in this to keep track of. Then there's the element of Superman not really being dead, but actually being in a weird Kryptonian coma that he's healing from, and it all culminating in the city from the Green Lantern comics blowing up. Adding to all of this, the story takes place in a very specific era of Superman continuity. So if you're someone who's just skimming the classics but is familiar with the classic version of these characters, there's a lot of weird stuff happening that could be confusing. For example, at this point, Supergirl is a shape-shifting blob named Matrix who is dating Lex Luthor, who has transferred his mind into a younger version of himself who has long red hair and is claiming to be the long-lost son of Lex Luthor from Australia. Number 2, the Clone Saga. The Clone Saga was a long-running event in Spider-Man comics that ran from 1994 all the way to 1996. It tells the story of Spider-Man's clone Ben Reilly coming back to town as a series of other clones show up to fight. They discover that Ben is actually the original and Peter is the clone, prompting Peter to retire as Ben takes over the superhero duties, and then it's eventually revealed that Green Goblin had manipulated the whole thing in a very weird plan and that Peter was in fact the original and Ben was in fact the clone. This series is convoluted more for editorial issues happening at the time. The story was meant to go on for a year, but was selling so well that the team was told to keep it going an extra year, forcing them to come up with increasingly crazy plot twists. The original intent was for Ben Reilly to stay as Spider-Man, as Marvel was once again trying to undo his marriage so they could get him back to basics. They eventually changed their minds, fearing fan reaction, and there was constant fights about the direction of the story, with Green Goblin both being alive and responsible being forced on the writers by editorial. To make things worse, all these problems made the story so convoluted that in order for any of it to make sense, people had to read an additional book called The Osborn Journal, which was just completely dedicated to the Goblin explaining his plan so that it even remotely made sense to the reader. Number 1. Hawkman's origin story. Hawkman has one of the most notoriously difficult origins to keep track of in all of comics, so I will be giving you an abridged version of his history. In his original 1940 origin, he is Egyptian royalty who has been reincarnated throughout time as a variety of different heroes before eventually becoming the archaeologist Carter Hall, spelled like this. Carter becomes Hawkman and fights crime. With me so far? When reintroduced in 1961, he is an alien cop from the planet Thanagar named Carter Hall, spelled like this. He comes to Earth and takes on the secret identity of an archaeologist named Carter Hall, with the original spelling. It makes sense when you think of him as a total reinvention of the original character. Where things start to get confusing is 2 years later when we learn that the two different versions are actually multiversal variants of each other, with the alien living on Earth 1 and the original being on Earth 2. In 1986, the Crisis on Infinite Earths happens, and all the worlds are combined into one. How to handle the continuity? Well, they changed it so that they were two different people who just happened to have similar sounding names and were both Hawkman at different points in history, with the original Egyptian prince version operating in the 40s and the alien space cop operating in the 80s. In 1994, Zero Hour happens, and all the various Hawkmen become one guy, but it doesn't stick. In 2011, the New 52 retcons Hawkman so that he is and always has been a space cop from Thanagar. In 2017, Carter with a C is reintroduced, with it being explained that he reincarnates because the knife he was killed with in Egypt was made of nth metal from a Thanagarian ship, kinda introducing elements of both origins. In 2018, we learned that the two versions have become one again, with the space cop being just one of Carter with a C's many reincarnations, retconning the character to be able to be reborn not just in different eras on Earth, but on different planets as well. So to sum it up briefly, reincarnated Pharaoh becomes space cop, becomes two different people. He is retconned to have only ever been a space cop and is retconned one last time to be a reincarnated Pharaoh who in one of his lives was an alien space cop. Which when you say it like that makes perfect sense. By the way, most of this also applies to Hawkgirl. Any other convoluted stories we didn't mention here? Let us know in the comments below, and remember to like and subscribe for more Top 10 Nerd.